In this video, we revisit how to export data from an XtraPivotGrid to an Excel spreadsheet using some of the XtraPivotGrid's features to control the way the data looks when we export it, such as hiding filter headers and adding a dynamic field with content. So let's take a look. So our target application will look roughly like this form here, an XtraPivotGrid with some data, a button to export the data, and a couple different field values here. So when we click the Export button, you'll notice we get a dynamic field added here, and we have an Excel spreadsheet with our exported data. The XtraPivotGrid uses a WYSIWYG approach. Notice that we have most of the data. We also have a dynamic field with some content added here that wasn't in the grid. I'll show you how to do that. Up here, notice this area is blank. Those are the filter headers that normally are here on the pivot grid, and I'll show you how to hide those. So to start, first add an extra form to your project. So we'll choose Add New Item and select Extra Form. And we'll change the startup to run the new form. And there it is. This will allow you to use the DevExpress look and feel feature for a professional appearance. From the toolbox, add an XtraPivotGrid control to the form and set its doc property to fill. Add a dataset to the form, and in the Add Dataset dialog, set the type to Untyped Dataset. You can see it's placed down here in the component panel. Open the dataset's properties window and click on the Tables property to display the Tables Collection Editor. And click the Add button to add a table. Set the table's table name property to Data. Click on the Columns property to open the Columns Collection Editor. Click Add 3 times to add the columns to the members list. Change Column 1's caption and column name to Name and data type to System.String. Change Column 2's caption and column name to Date and data type to System.Date. And let's change Column 3's caption and column name to Value and data type to System.Decimal. If you use an existing dataset, then you could skip this part of the process. Close the Columns Collection Editor and Tables Collection Editor. Let's go back to the XtraPivotGrid's properties. Set the XtraPivotGrid's data source property to Dataset1 and the data member property to Data. To initiate the export, we'll use a button. Drag and drop a simple button from the toolbox, place it to the right, and anchor it to the right. Then let's give it a name. Export. Right-click on the XtraPivotGrid and click Run Designer to run the XtraPivotGrid's property editor. In the field list, select Name and drag and drop the Name field from the field list to the PivotGrid list. Repeat the process adding 2 dates and 3 values to the PivotGrid list. Click on the PivotGrid field name and change the area property to Row Area, so this will appear along the horizontal. Click on the PivotGrid field date and change the area property to Column Area. Change the caption to Year and the group interval property to Date Year. Then let's click on the PivotGrid field date 1 and change the area property to Column Area. Change the caption to Date. Click on the PivotGrid field value and change the area property to Data Area and the caption to Sum, which also is the default summary type property value. Click on the PivotGrid field value 1 and change the area property to Data Area, the caption to Count, and the summary type to Count. Click on the PivotGrid field value 2 and change the caption to Average and the summary type to Average. Let's close the designer. Now you can see I've got my column filters, my row data, and my data area data. Next thing we'll do is switch to Code View to populate our data source. Implement the form load event to call populate table and refresh the table data in the XtraPivotGrid. And call best fit. And best fit will size the individual's data columns to best fit and represent the sample data. Implement populate table. This is just adding test data to the dataset. It does this just by grabbing the table from the dataset and adding some row data. And now we'll double-click on our export button and then implement the export behavior. So the first statement calls begin update, which essentially stops the XtraPivotGrid from updating as we're making several changes to its appearance. And we'll finish that up with an end update once we're all done. And I've got a reference to a pivot grid field here, so I'll click on that and add the reference. These first three statements will hide those filter headers, data and column headers, those extra buttons that we need at design time to move data around, but we don't need in Excel. This block of code demonstrates how to dynamically add a pivot grid field. And this is the workhorse. This statement invokes the built-in behavior to export to Excel. And by using process.start, the file system in Windows knows that .xls files are associated with Excel. The exception shows a message. Here we remove our dynamically added field. So let's run the application. Here I have my data, sums, averages, headers, etc. I click Export, and there's Excel. And notice that my filter buttons are not here. So it's WYSIWYG, but we can control getting rid of some of the extraneous data. Let's close that and stop the demo. And change to Design View and select the XtraPivotGrid. Open the Properties window and implement a custom export field value event and a field value display text event. Add the code for custom export field value and add the namespace devexpress.extraprinting for TextBrick. TextBrick basically represents the block of text that's displayed in an Excel spreadsheet. And what this code is going to do is it's going to format that dynamic field export header. We also need the method that goes with that, the helper method, getLayoutDescription. And this method just does some of our formatting for us. In this example, we're getting pivot grid fields, and we're adding some additional text to them. You'll see this additional text appear in the data split, so you'll see this text as well as the data split. Finally, we'll add the code for field value display text. Let's clean it up a little. This method is called when the export to XLS is called. This actually uses this dynamic field to display a wait message. That's going to show up on the XtraPivotGrid as we're doing the export. Then this getLayoutDescription, in conjunction with this event handler custom export field method, will change that field and add some data we'd like to see in Excel. So let's run the application one more time. And here it is. You can see the headers we don't want to show up in Excel. Notice there's no pivot grid above here at this time. If I click Export, there's my wait message, and now that field becomes this formatted value. Thanks for watching, and of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress.